Hello everyone and welcome to Not So Newsworthy for the 20th of October 2018. This week, the People's Vote March has swept through London in numbers estimated to be around 600,000. The protesters have been backed by mainstream political figures like Sadiq Khan, Lord Adonis, Alistair Campbell and Nicola Sturgeon, and also by media personalities such as Andy Serkis. The main thrust of the venture, of course, is to put pressure on the government to issue a second referendum on Brexit, something which Theresa May has, thank goodness, ruled out of her otherwise awful Brexit negotiations. Personally, I support the right of these people to march for what they believe in. It's a key part of democracy. However, many of the protesters are politicising their children. As the BBC reports, there are lots of young families there, some with children wrapped in EU flags. Here we can see a young boy holding a sign saying, "I heart EU." This is awful behaviour from protesters. This child has absolutely no idea why he is holding the sign. Look at that face. He doesn't even know where he is. He hasn't been alive long enough to even comprehend what the EU is, let alone whether it is worth loving. The inability by many protesters to distinguish between the EU and Europe is also more than a little baffling. This woman here holds a sign which says, "Never gonna give EU up," with a hand-drawn image of Rick Astley. Does she realise that under EU regulations, her comedic use of the line from Astley's famous song would be banned? That she needs a licence for that sign in effect? The EU regulations pertaining to the internet won't stop there. Eventually they will persist into offline activities. Is it not a logical jump that if online memes are banned, then they will come for the offline representations of copyrighted material as well? I doubt she even knows what the EU does, or how it does it. Another sign here states, "We want our country back." Again, I have to ask, how on earth does handing over legislative power to an unelected foreign body give us control of our country back? Unless this is a counter-protester lost in the sea of Europhiles, I have to look on in baffled amazement at the sheer demonstration of ignorance in the wording of this sign alone. Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and I will add in here, the worst mayor London has had in the entirety of its recent history, under whose judgment and watch crime has risen to extraordinary levels, who started the march, is among those who addressed Parliament Square alongside Steve Coogan, Delia Smith and Deborah Meaden. Mr. Khan told the assembled protesters that it was important that those saying that a second referendum is unpatriotic and undemocratic is in fact the opposite. I won't contend that it's a patriotic movement. I would also outline that the EU is killing our country, and most of the protesters will have absolutely no inclination as to the workings of the EU, the damages that its proclamations have incurred, or the continued poor judgment that it exhibits in its mismanagement of the continent it claims to serve. The protesters believe they are saving the UK from barrelling over the waterfall, when in fact the waterfall is the EU, and they are trying to speed us towards it. Students are one of the strong arms of the march, such as Emily Longman, aged 20, who is concerned about the possible loss of Erasmus funding. She stands alongside middle-aged families who want more jobs for their children and European unity, and the elderly, who believe the EU is a place of peace and strength. This again demonstrates a crippling underappreciation of what the EU actually does. EU policy directly harms small businesses regularly, and tariffs and regulation make it difficult to compete with established business. The EU also dictates that nations implement destabilising policies, including forcing nations to accept migrants in greater numbers than they have provision for. The culture clash between what is effectively a colony of foreign nationals and local residents has caused more instability and a decrease in the peace of Europe. I cannot comment on Erasmus, but it seems a small price to pay for autonomy and freedom. I doubt very much that the UK as a whole would be opposed to setting up its own funding system to help UK nationals study abroad if people campaigned hard enough for it in the wake of Brexit. But I digress. The idea of a People's Vote March is a sham, an affront to the democratic process, and should be looked at for what it really is, a group of summarily distressed, uncomprehending voters having their day of catharsis. Sajid Javid has come under fire this week for tweeting about grooming gangs in a racial context. He tweeted, "These sick Asian paedophiles are finally facing justice. I want to commend the bravery of the victims. For too long they were ignored. Not on my watch. There will be no no-go areas. Apparently stating the facts is racist now. The tweet was condemned by no less than David Lammy, himself a regular supporter of affirmative action and broad stroke attacking white people on the basis of the colour of their skin as seen here, claiming that signalling the race of the offenders panders to the far right and increases the risk of violence and abuse against minorities across the country. He goes on to say that paedophilia is a crime that affects all communities. It does no service to the victims of this evil to pin the blame on any one group. Except, of course, that there is hardly anyone else to blame in this case, David. Over 90% of grooming gang paedophiles were Asian. This is, for once, a racialised issue. That's not to say that all Asians are pedos, or that people should go out in the street clubbing them to death, but the fact remains that the convict's race was a common factor, and highlighting it helps direct the path of investigation into specific communities. Diane Abbott, the incompetent ex-floozy of Jeremy Corbyn, said, "Attempts by authorities to attribute these crimes to one ethnic group does nothing to support these vulnerable women." Yes, it does, Diane. Ethnicity is not race, and if more than a significant majority of perpetrators, in this case, are from, say, Pakistan, then we need to look at what cultural factors are causing this enormous overrepresentation in this community of paedophiles. There's nothing racist about that. Zubaida Haq, whose name I'm definitely butchering, of the Runnymede Trust, weighed in as well to say that racialising this crime and focusing on the ethnicity of the predators has done little to address why and how these victims were vulnerable to the prey of these sexual predators. Grammar aside, Zubaida, it is because they were white or Sikh. They were vulnerable and targeted based on the colour of their skin or because of their religion by people whose religious beliefs and culture tell them it is okay to enslave and rape members of other groups. It is as simple, as barbaric, and as sickening as that. A trans woman has won the World Championship of Women's Cycling this week. Rachel McKinnon, an assistant professor, originally from Canada but from South Carolina, won the trophy and is pictured here next to runners-up Caroline van Herrickhuizen and Jennifer Wagner. McKinnon is pre-op, and despite having hormone replacement to lower overall testosterone levels, it is clear that her frame and musculature are definitively male. Jennifer Wagner took to Twitter after McKinnon received backlash for her win to lay out that in her view, the result was indeed unfair, something I am inclined to agree with. Gender may be a social construct, ill-defined and poorly understood by many on the left to be a spectrum rather than the bimodal distribution it truly is, but sex is not. The allowance of biological men to compete in a biological woman's sport is not only facilitating the creation of an uneven playing field, or track in this case, but lowers the value of the achievement for whichever trans person wins. There is a reason why the World Cup women's football team trains against and regularly loses against the 17-year-old boys team. It is nothing to do with gender, it is everything to do with biology. There should be no glory in defeating opponents over whom you have such a massive unfair advantage, in size, in strength, and even to the point of muscle composition and distribution. ITV has released a new TV series this week called Butterfly, featuring a transgender protagonist. As the Telegraph outlines, the stereotypical father figure is a builder who is violent and abusive, his mother is well-meaning but stressed, and the grandmother is the stereotypical old dinosaur who is bigoted beyond belief. The characters are comical, pantomime villains. The drama unashamedly supports existing propaganda from the transgender activist movement, which I distinguish from the transgender group as a whole. The TV show portrays a suicide attempt and finishes with the titular Max being advised to take puberty blockers. This show is nothing more than moral blackmail and an attempt to push the claim that existing treatments are the correct procedure for trans children. Statistically, more than 90% of children with gender dysphoria grow out of it. Most of them turn out to be gay or going through a phase. For the few that remain in their late teens and early 20s that still feel dysphoric, surgery becomes an option. This show aggressively pushes the narrative that unless you identify that your child is trans and adjust your life to accept it, that they are going to top themselves and you should get them to hormone replacement therapy sharpish. Having girls who want to play outside or boys who like to do ballet labelled as trans does far more harm than good. I fully expect in the coming years for those children who are actually placed on HRT before the age of consent to end up suing their parents for chemically castrating them and taking their lives from them. Children do not understand the ramifications of their actions. This is a key reason for the age of consent and the voter age restriction in the first place. The show is supported and heavily influenced by Mermaids UK, a charity claiming to support transgender rights, and yet the charity has consistently put out misinformation regarding the trans population and in particular suicide rates. As Fair Play for Women reveals, Mermaids consistently claims that around 59% of trans people have attempted suicide. This is coming from a study of 2,000 people. It's not just misleading, it's factually untrue. The study they cite from did indeed have 2,000 participants. 2,000 LGBT participants, of whom 27 were trans, 16 of which claimed to have attempted suicide, thus leaving us with the much smaller overall figure of 0.9% of participants. In reality, it should be phrased as, from a study of 27 trans people, 16 claimed to have attempted suicide. Now the figure of 59% will be correct, but the size of the study discredits it from ever possibly being representative. In short, avoid this TV series, and inform your friends as to both who is behind it and the misinformation it promotes. Finally for this week, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has finally done it, ladies and gentlemen. He banned gender studies nationwide, lambasting it as an ideology, not a science, which it is. Hungarian students will be allowed to finish their existing gender studies courses, but no further government funding will be given to institutions for the subject, and offering a course in the subject is now illegal. The Central European University in Budapest hit back, claiming that eliminating the programme will be a significant loss to the Hungarian scholarly community and for the democratically minded public. This is hilarious. The idea that there is any scientific or academic rigour in grievance studies such as gender studies is laughable. They don't cite, they don't apply scientific rigour, and their primary output is activism and activists, not scholars. As Orban's deputy Zsolt Semjim says, the labour market demand for gender studies graduates is effectively zero. No one wants to employ a genderologist. The only loss to the Hungarian scholarly community is in the funding that will no longer be given to training an anti-freedom, pro-propaganda activism corps. Whilst I would have preferred to see only the removal of government funding for the course, thus forcing the universities to self-fund and by extension self-implode due to lack of interest, this is a very welcome change. Something which my government wouldn't have the stones to do because it is so far in bed with the activists the courses produce. I hope one day to see government support for all grievance studies courses abolished worldwide, but we'll see. This concludes Not So Newsworthy for this week. Please like, subscribe and leave a comment. If you enjoyed this segment, please consider supporting me on Patreon using the link in the description. Thank you very much and have a great week.